seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with Bob Short of Kalamazoo, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay. Now, Bob, can you begin with some background on yourself, and to start with, where and when were you born?
I was born in 1949, July of 49, in Vandalia, Illinois.
Okay. And did you grow up there, or did you move somewhere else?
I actually lived in a town about 10 miles to the west of Vandalia, a small rural farming community, Mulberry Grove, 750 people, and probably at least that many dogs running loose. But it was a great place to grow up. You know, small town, everyone knew everyone else.
Okay. And what did your family do for a living at that point?
My father was a truck driver, so he was gone quite a bit. My mother was a stay-at-home mother, took care of things at home and kept things in line.
All right. And when did you finish high school?
Graduated from high school in 1967.
Okay. And then at that point, what did you want to do with yourself?
I sort of had always known, or had known for a long time, that I wanted to serve in the military. I mean, I grew up, my father was a World War II veteran. I grew up knowing and believing that it was an honorable thing to do. I still believe that. So somewhere along the line, I got the idea in my head that why not go to West Point? And so it was sort of a pipe dream, and I think most people looked at me like, you know, this isn't going to happen. But it did happen. I was able to get a congressional appointment, and a month after graduating from high school, I found myself as a new cadet at West Point.
Okay. How did you get the congressional appointment?
I just followed the normal process. I didn't have any connections. There was an application process. My local congressman, did not know him, but applied with a lot of other people. I'd been a pretty good student and active in sports and things like that, had a pretty good school record, and somehow was selected.
Okay. And what sorts of people did you have recommending you?
I honestly don't remember. I must have had some references of some kind, but I'm guessing probably high school principal, teachers primarily.
Okay. So you just followed the instructions and it actually worked?
It actually worked.
All right. Now, this was in 1967. How aware were you of the Vietnam War at that point?
I was certainly aware of it, naive regarding what war was all about in many respects, I think. Having watched movies and TV shows following World War II, where it's glorified to a great extent. But I was also curious about how would I do, how would I perform, and wanted to find out.
Now, do you recall much about the news coverage of Vietnam before you went in? Did it seem to be not necessarily negative, or?
No, I don't recall it being negative in like 66, 67.
Yeah.
And of course, when I went to West Point, pretty much didn't see news coverage. You know, you're very isolated, you're very focused, day-to-day activities, no TV, little if any newspaper, so I was sort of in the dark at that point.
Okay, well, talk a little bit. Take us through your West Point experiences. You arrive, you know, in July '67. What do you do there at the beginning?
Well, the first 2 months is referred to as Beast Barracks, and it's challenging to say the least. You're on the run night and day, people in your face all the time, lots of yelling and screaming. A lot of memorization of trivial data that you have to regurgitate to the upperclassmen when they ask for it. Meal schedules, what's on the menu for today, all 3 meals. So every night we did a lot of memorizing of trivial things like that. And you could never get it right. You know, somebody's always going to be correcting you and in your face. A lot of physical activity. It's essentially basic training exaggerated with all the harassment by upperclassmen.
Okay. Now, were you expecting that, or did you?
Sure. Yeah, I kind of knew what was going to happen.
Okay.
And I got through that fine. You know, and then the academic year starts in the fall, and so I did 3 academic semesters there in 2 summers. The second summer, essentially, is a little advanced training. We spent more time in the field. We went down to Fort Knox and drove tanks and APCs and fired all their weapon systems. West Point actually has an artillery range, so we spent some time learning how to fire 105s, actually firing them, but also learning how to adjust fire, things like that. We did a lot of navigation, land navigation activity. So it was good training and paid off for me later in Vietnam.
All right. And the academic part of it during the regular term, I mean, what kind of course load do you carry? And
You go to school 6 days a week, 5 Monday through Friday, and then half a day on Saturday, and typically part of the year at least, Saturday afternoon is filled with parades and all those sorts of things. And you carry roughly 20 semester hours. Actually, I spent 3 semesters there. When I went back to college later on, I had enough credit to be a junior. So
all right.
it's a pretty heavy load.
Okay, so you said you did 3 semesters, so why do you leave?
I got through plebe year just fine. And while I was home on leave, you get a month's leave after your first year. While I was home on leave, my mother died. She had had cancer for some time. So I went back and I got through the summer activities and got into the next semester. But I was starting to just lose focus, and also wasn't real happy with what I was getting academically. I felt it was a lot of cramming stuff in every night, regurgitating it the next day. I didn't feel like I was actually learning much in the courses I was taking. It just wasn't my style of learning. And so I started to become a little disillusioned and started to question whether I wanted to complete this and then spend 5 more years in the military minimum. Whereas at that time you could opt out, choose to leave voluntarily during the first 2 years without automatically incurring a military obligation. So after the first semester of the second year, and I wasn't alone, there were several of us who said, maybe this is the time to leave. So it's just not what I thought it was going to be, and not the career choice for me.
Okay, so that gets us, that was sort of the fall term 68, was sort of, you completed that.
Right.
And what did you do then after you left?
I left there in February of 68.
Or 9, probably.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Had to be 69, I'm sorry, yeah. So I was there from July of 67 to February of 68.
Okay.
So I went home, but I also knew that I still wanted to finish college. I didn't have the funds to do that, nor did my family. My dad was still paying off my mother's medical bills and had a lot of responsibilities. So I said, well, the GI Bill. And the way you get that is to do active duty. So I went to my local draft board and said, I'm ready to go. And of course, they were very accommodating back in those days. And a short time later, I found myself on a bus early one morning before daylight, headed for St. Louis and to the induction center. Was sworn in, and then we were bussed on down to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri.
Okay. Now, did you have to do basic training, or did your West Point experience count for anything?
I went to Fort Leonard Wood thinking I probably would have to just start over, but I was actually standing in a line being processed at one point and ran into a former schoolmate. He had been a year ahead of me in high school. He enlisted right after high school, airborne infantry, had already been to Vietnam with the 173rd Airborne Brigade, had come back. He was now working at Fort Leonard Wood helping process troops. So he sees me in this line and he says, what are you doing here? And I explained to him, and he says, wait here a minute. So he comes back with an old first sergeant. He looked old to me. He was probably 35 years old. But he looked old to me at the time. And this guy looks at my records and, kind of thumbs through things, and he says, do you really want to go to basic training? And I said, not unless I have to, Sergeant. And he gave it a little more thought. And then he looked at me and he said, son, you look like you'd make a damn fine 11 Bravo infantryman to me. And I said, that's okay. I was okay with that at that point. So I bypassed basic training, AIT, took a little bit of leave, and then went directly to Vietnam.
Okay, so you don't really get any training there per se at all?
None.
Okay,
None.
so there's no preparation for Vietnam or anything else like that?
No.
Okay, but you'd had weapons training, and you'd had...
Yeah, I have felt in retrospect that the training I had at West Point, the 2 summers in particular, prepared me very well. And in fact, I had skills that other people didn't have. I had better map reading skills. I knew how to adjust artillery and aircraft, airstrikes. So I had some skills that other people didn't have, which really paid off.
Okay, so now how do they get you to Vietnam?
I remember flying to Oakland, to a big warehouse there full of troops waiting to be shipped over.
Right.
Went over on a chartered aircraft. We stopped in Guam, I believe, maybe Hawaii as well, for refueling stops, and then on into Tan Son Nhut, to a big replacement center there.
Okay. What's your first impression of Vietnam when you get there?
Hot. And you know, we're all jumpy. We're like, okay, you know, the plane makes a pretty steep dive going in, lands, we get out, the door opens, it's extremely hot. But I went to this replacement center in, I believe, Long Binh, and I was there for a few days waiting orders. Teamed up with a guy from California. I don't know how we met, but we hung out together, went to chow together. We were assigned for a day or two to assign a small or to guard a small building that we were told was the paymaster's building. So it's like the bank. They gave us each an M14, I think one magazine of ammunition. We sat in chairs at the front door, one on either side. It was like the Old West, like guarding the jail for a day or two and before we got our assignments. We ended up being assigned to the same company, different platoons. Unfortunately, within 4 or 5 weeks, he was dead.
All right. Now, when did you actually get to Vietnam?
May 26, 1969.
All right. And what unit did they assign you to?
They assigned me to the Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 46th Infantry, which was at that point part of the 198th Light Infantry Brigade. They had gone over with the 198th, part of the Americal division.
Right.
And in July then, we were under the operational control of the 196th Brigade, which had the area just to the north of ours. And so we were officially moved from the 198th to the 196th, even though we stayed geographically in the same spot.
Okay. And what part of Vietnam were you operating in?
This would have been Quang Nam Province, which was southern, what we called First Corps, I Corps.
Okay. And then where is that relative to Chu Lai?
Our area of operation and our fire support base was a little bit to the, slightly to the north, but mainly west of Chu Lai.
Okay, so inland a little bit.
Inland, yeah. Yeah, we weren't on the coastal areas where there was heavy population. It was primarily mountainous areas, so-called free fire zone where there were very, very few civilians living.
Okay, and then how do they get you from Long Binh up to your unit?
We flew up. I don't know what kind of an aircraft, but we flew up there. Maybe a C-130, I'm not sure.
But military aircraft? at this
Military
point,
aircraft,
yeah.
sure.
All
sure.
right. And then where do you think you would have landed? Would that have been at Chu Lai? Or
We landed in Chu Lai,
Okay.
and we were bused then to the Americal division had what they called the combat center, which was where all the new recruits went or new replacements went for a few days to get some refresher training and get acclimated to the weather a little bit and kind of settle down, hopefully, before going out to the field to their unit.
All right. And then how do they get you out to your unit?
We were picked up by a truck, a deuce-and-a-half truck, hauled to our battalion area, which was in Chu Lai. I was there for maybe a day or two, and then helicopter. The only way out to our fire base was by helicopter, so we went out by Huey.
Okay.
And I remember that ride very well.
Okay. Can you describe that a little bit, or what it's like to...
Well, it was tense. I remember getting on the aircraft fairly early in the morning. There was a major there seeing us off who was probably the battalion executive officer. And I remember him asking me where I was from, and I told him Illinois, and he said, I was already in the aircraft. He was standing on the outside. He patted me on the leg and said, "Good luck, son." Away we went. But I remember the flight out, you know, just looking at the territory and realizing how hostile it looked. And then we came inside of the fire base, which was just a hill that had been cleared off. And we circled in and landed, and I think I was there for a day or so before the next resupply chopper went out to my company and went out to them then.
All right. And what kind of reception do you get when you join the company?
I think like most new people are a little wary of you initially. I do remember getting off the chopper and the company field first sergeant had flown out with us. He wasn't going to stay, but he went out on a resupply bird. And when I got off, I remember him, he grabbed me and he took me over to, I think, the company commander, and he told the company commander about my West Point experience. And so that didn't hurt me at all with him. But with the rank and file, I got assigned to a squad, and you know, they're just cautious around new people, like I was later on. And you know, it's a wait and see how if you're gonna prove yourself or not to be, you know, acceptable.
Okay. Now, the terrain you're in, is this forested or jungle or something else?
Mostly heavily forested jungle, pretty thick in most cases. Hills, small mountains, oftentimes, you know, at like 400 to 600 meters high, that type of terrain.
Okay. And now you joined him this morning and so forth. Now do you move out with him that day, or do they
I got there right at dusk, actually.
Okay.
So my first night was in the field. We got dark shortly thereafter. And I remember being assigned a period of time where I was on guard duty for our position. And I remember literally putting my hand in front of my face and realizing I can't see my hand. It's dark. It's very dark. Heavy vegetation overhead, so no moonlight if there was any moonlight coming in. And sitting there very nervous with my M16, of course, across my lap, and with a Claymore firing device close by. And you know, we had trip flares out, of course, for early warning.
Okay. And I mean, were you dug in? Were you in foxholes or anything?
We
or?
were dug in that night. They had already dug in before I arrived.
Okay. And do you share the hole with somebody else, or do they just leave you there and go sleep someplace else?
No, I think we had a fighting position set up where we had a poncho set up, and I had an air mattress at the time, and I put too much air in it, and it made squeaking noises when you moved on it. And I remember someone nearby whispering very loudly, saying, "You let some air out of that thing, or there's going to get a knife in it. We're going to deflate it for you." So I learned quickly. Okay.
All right, so they're enforcing noise discipline then.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. This unit had been through, about 2 weeks before I arrived in country, this unit had been through some pretty heavy stuff, and they were real uptight, real together, very, very cautious. Nobody was, you know, they were very disciplined.
Okay. Now, was the whole company together at this point?
I believe so.
Okay. And do you have a sense of how large it was at the time?
It was hard to tell because everyone's scattered. And one of the things I learned throughout my time in the infantry was that you could, and then normally I learned that we normally were about 80 people, 60 to 80 people, company strength. But often you saw very few people at any one time because you're scattered, you're spread out. Even when you form a perimeter at night on a hilltop, for example, there's not a lot of mingling. You have your position. You know your platoon pretty well. You know where they're at. And you know there are other people around the other side of the perimeter, but you don't really see them.
All right. So you got through the first night. Anything happen?
No, it was quiet,
Okay,
fortunately.
That's good.
Fortunately.
All right. And then what happens the next day?
Next day, one of my memories is that, well, we walked. We humped up and down hills all day long. I don't recall any action, but I remember being extremely tired and not quite acclimated to this regiment yet. And I remember at the end of the day, we were climbing a hill, and it was tall grass, and so we weren't the point platoon. So by the time we were going up this hill, the grass was smashed down. It was very slippery. I remember feeling like I was taking one step forward and 2 steps back, and I was very, very happy to get to the top of that hill. And over time, of course, I got toughened up. I thought I was in pretty good shape to start with, but I found that I had to get used to that routine of carrying that weight and walking all day.
Now, when you're in the forested areas and so forth, would you use the trails or go off the trails?
Some of both. Using trails were faster, but also more dangerous because we did encounter booby traps, usually grenades and things like that rigged with tripwires. So it was more dangerous, but you could move more quickly. Our preference really was to stay off the trails where possible, even though that meant usually cutting a trail with machetes through the jungle. Most of the time it was pretty thick. So it was a lot more work and a lot more slow going, but safer.
And as you're going out on these first patrols with this unit, are there people who are telling you what to do, or do you just kind of follow them and hope for the best?
I was mainly just observing.
Okay.
And I picked out a person early on who seemed to really have his act together, and so I kind of just watched him closely and mimicked what he did. But also I had a great squad leader, and I felt accepted pretty quickly. I had grown up, you know, camping and things like that. I was pretty comfortable in that environment, relatively speaking, compared to people who had never, maybe had grown up in New York City and had never been in the woods and spent time on the ground. So I was more comfortable than some. I think that showed. And had grown up hunting, so I was accustomed to weapons, felt comfortable, you know, basically stalking, moving quietly through the jungle. So I felt accepted, and I had a great squad leader. I remember him giving me some time to, just sort of get acclimated and adjusted. And I also remember the first time he allowed me to walk point, and he says, "I'm right behind you." He says, "Move carefully, slowly. If anything moves, shoot it. Yeah, don't hesitate." And I remember moving very slowly, very slowly that first day.
All right. And when you did move, what kind of formation did you have, or what kind of spacing did you have between men normally?
It depended on the vegetation. You didn't want to lose contact with one another, but you also wanted to stay as spaced out as possible. So normally it would be probably 5 meters apart, something like that. And obviously, so that if you did encounter something, you'd minimize the potential for casualties.
And how long was it before you started to make contact?
I don't remember exactly. I do remember the first contact. It wasn't very long. It was within the first week or two.
Okay.
We had moved. We were moving, and my platoon was on point, and we were moving from a small hill down through a saddle to another small hill. And we were down in the saddle and starting to move up the next hill, and someone behind us, who probably had better vision across because he was still higher, fired his M79 over us. So you hear this bloop, and right after he fires it, he yells, "Someone's up there!" And then the round hit up above, ahead of us. And so he had seen movement ahead. And so we all dropped and opened fire, and didn't get any return fire that I know of, but he clearly spotted someone. So we ended up crawling up the rest of the way. We found a rucksack that someone had dropped. So there had been some troops up there, but they took off.
All right. Now, is there sort of a general pattern of things in the first few months you're out there? What are you doing during that time?
Our normal routine, we worked off of fire support base, LZ Professional. And so there were 4 line companies in the battalion and a recon platoon. So there was always one of the 4 companies on the fire base providing security for the artillery support there in the battalion headquarters. So the other 3 companies were always patrolling around there in the jungle, looking for the enemy, looking for signs of activity. So roughly it was 3 weeks out on patrol and then a week back on the fire base providing security there, which was seen as easy duty because you weren't humping the bushes and carrying all the weight every day. But you were also sort of a target there as well. You were kind of open in the open. So,
Okay.
So about 3 weeks out, a week there.
All right. And was there a lot of enemy activity in the area at the time?
It slowed down. It had been very heavy right before I got there. In fact, I joined a squad who had had 6 people killed shortly before I got there. So I was one of the replacements for one.
And how large was the squad normally?
We averaged 8 to 10, 12 people.
Okay,
somewhere in
so
that range.
losing 6 at once is pretty dramatic. Yeah.
In the middle of May, I got there in late May, the middle of May, an estimated division moved through the area, and they ended up hitting all the companies. They basically shattered all the companies, hit them basically all at the same time, hit the fire support base, did a lot of damage with recoilless rifles and things. And my platoon, my company, Charlie Company, had been trying to link up with Alpha Company, who was about to be annihilated. They were surrounded, and these 6 guys were killed in the process.
All right. So your timing wasn't bad then?
No, I lucked out in the way of timing. The action tapered off some after that. It was just sporadic, small action. You know, we would bump into people, and they bump into us, and you know, it was. But you never knew when that was going to happen. That was part of the routine. It was always a little tense because you knew, even though it's quiet right now, things can change in an instant.
And were these, as far as you can tell, North Vietnamese that you were dealing with now?
Yeah, there were very, very few civilians or people who had been labeled as Viet Cong out in that area. We basically were a blocking force for North Vietnamese troops who were coming down the so-called Ho Chi Minh Trail and moving toward the coastal areas.
Yeah, because the Americal's area was sort of an outlet area, and so you've got a lot of enemy reinforcements going through there, and that's what they had run into. Okay, describe a little bit what do you do at night when you're in the field? You've been walking for X amount of time, and then what?
We normally would find some high ground if possible, and set up a perimeter around the top of, say, a hill. We would have, we'd be spaced out, of course, and try to provide, if we had time, try to dig in. Oftentimes we didn't have time, and that also kind of destroyed the noise discipline when you're digging as well. So oftentimes we just move in as quietly as possible, set up, and just we typically paired up. We carried ponchos, and so we paired up, and one person's poncho would typically go on the ground. The other person's poncho would be rigged above for shelter from rain and so forth. And so we slept on the ground. We took turns throughout the night at each position with someone awake. We typically were able to set out trip flares as early warning devices, and then claymore mines. So if a trip flare went off, you blew the mine. So it was a typical routine.
And would you operate normally as the full company, or would you split into platoons? Or
We oftentimes split up. Normally weren't too far away from one another because, again, if you're in a platoon size and you run into any sizable North Vietnamese force, you're going to be in trouble. And so we normally were pretty close together, but oftentimes would split up and patrol separately.
And did your night positions ever get probed or attacked by the enemy?
They did.
Okay.
They did. That's a scary routine.
Okay, and then what kinds of things happened in that situation?
I'll give you an example. We had one instance where we started to hear movement, and everybody's on alert. And at some point, we started tossing frag grenades and tried to avoid firing our weapons because at night, that gives your position away. We ended up using claymore mines, and the probe stopped. So I think by catching the movement early on, we probably prevented some further action.
And did you have situations where they actually did get in among you when you're out at night, or did you manage to keep
I
them away?
never encountered that, no,
right.
unfortunately.
Now, what about when you're on the fire base? Would they probe that or use mortars or?
That was actually, looking back, it was probably a more dangerous position than being out in the field. I can recall an incident where we did have probing, and of course, again, we're using grenades, and the next morning, nobody got through the wire. Well, actually, it did get through the wire. Nobody got into our perimeter, and into our bunkers. But the next morning, when the sun came up, we looked out, and there was a wounded North Vietnamese soldier lying right in front of our bunker, still alive. And he had his satchel charges wrapped around him. And we found some other North Vietnamese who had been killed. So they were certainly trying to get through.
Okay.
And came very close.
All right. Now, what kind of people did you have in your company? What did you know about in terms of like where they were from or why they were there?
We had a cross-section of people. As you might expect, we had a draft back then, so people from all walks of life were being drafted. We had people who had volunteered. We had a lot of young 18, 19, 20-year-olds. If a person had finished college and was 22 or 23 years old, they were considered an old guy in the group. Very, very few were going to, who were planning to make the military their career. They were simply doing their duty. And I'd have to say that most of them did very well. The people responded to the challenge. They may not have wanted to be there. They may have been drafted. They didn't volunteer. But put in that situation, they responded well, and we looked after one another, took care of one another, and I think did pretty well overall.
Okay. Now, you get a fair amount of turnover in personnel over the course of a year. I mean, the officers normally don't stay more than 6 months somewhere, and enlisted men for a year, but you're all on your own clocks and calendars and so forth. Let's see, you mentioned, you had a good squad leader when you came in. About how long had he been in country, do you think?
He probably had been in country 6 to 8 months. So yeah, and then when he rotated out, I became the squad leader. Okay. And actually, I was a squad leader as an E4, and we had lots of E5s and even some E6s, but they were relatively inexperienced, so I was given the job.
Okay. And so a lot of the sergeants were people who had been sort of the shake and bake type, maybe?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
They come over for the States without combat experience.
Exactly.
And some of them even were E6s if they had done well enough in NCO training.
That's correct.
Okay.
And normally we didn't put them in, normally the company commanders did not, at least in my company, did not put them into responsible positions right away. They would be just like any other soldier or private who would learn the ropes and learn how we operated and what to do, what not to do before they were given any leadership positions.
Okay. And was your original company commander a good one? Did you have much of an impression of him one way or another?
I don't know that he was my original. I think the company commander who was in charge when I first got there, I never really got acquainted with, and he moved on fairly quickly.
Okay.
The one who followed him, I had mixed feelings about. He was very, very gung-ho, and a lot of us felt he would take risks, put us in danger at times when it was unnecessary. The person who followed him, on the other hand, I thought was very, very capable, did his job well, you know, made us do our jobs well, but also didn't, you know, put us at risk unnecessarily. I also had a great platoon leader for most of the time I was there. He was the kind of person that all of us, I think, would have followed anywhere.
And do you know anything about his background? I mean, was he an OCS guy or?
He was OCS.
Okay.
Yep.
And so not a West Pointer himself.
No, he was not. No, we had both,
Okay.
and you know, some they're good ones from all walks of life or all ways from getting their commission, and there are some that aren't as effective, like
All right.
any job.
Okay. Now, did you spend the full year in Vietnam?
I actually spent a year and a half.
Okay. So you.
I spent pretty much the full year, my first full year in the infantry. And because I had volunteered for the draft and not gone through basic training in the IT, I spent that year and still had almost a year left of my 2-year obligation. So I went to my company commander at the time and said, you know, I was scheduled to go back to Fort Hood, Texas, and spend another 10 months. And I went to my company commander and said, look, in order to get an early out, I would just as soon stay in Vietnam for a while longer, but not in the infantry. If you could find me a relatively safe job somewhere, I'd just as soon stay here and fulfill my obligation and get out early.
Okay, so you did extend it. Okay, now go back to that first year. Did sort of the pattern or whatever you had at the beginning of the tour, is that pretty much the way things stayed the whole time you were there?
Pretty much. We stayed the entire time in the same area of operation, working off the same fire base. With one exception, we moved for just a short period of time to a fire base called Marianne, much further to the west, and then came back to professional. But it's pretty much the same routine for the year.
Okay, because Marianne in '71 got hit very badly. It was sort of the last kind of ugly incident I think we had militarily.
Right,
But
and that was Charlie Company, the same company I had been with.
But by then, different personnel, different situation, and so forth. Okay, so you've got kind of a higher degree of continuity in a way in your experience than a lot of guys do over the course of that year. Over the course of the 12 months you're with the line company, kind of what level of casualties did you take?
We had 5 KIAs and a lot of less severe injuries. Some fairly severe, but a lot of minor injuries, shrapnel injuries, things like that. Turnover was pretty high.
Okay. And did you ever encounter any substantial enemy forces over the course of that year?
Small groups only. I was, again, very fortunate.
Okay.
They would kind of seem to be, during that period of time, unlike right before I'd gotten there, kind of lying low and regrouping.
All right. And how do you characterize the morale in the platoon? I mean, you said the guys generally performed pretty well.
We did a lot of complaining, like soldiers do. But all in all, again, we hung together pretty well. And even when tempers maybe were starting to flare or people were maybe on the verge of getting out of control, someone else would step forward and pull in the reins. And we had overall good leadership, which I think makes a big difference. I think the units that got into trouble from time to time didn't have maybe a strong leadership, and things got out of hand, could get out of hand pretty quickly. I think all of us who have been in combat know that there's a fine line sometime between sanity and insanity. It's not as easy as flipping a switch and turning it off. And,
Yeah. You kind of train people essentially to fight and kill other people and so forth, and then you also want them to be
get all
civilized
that
people.
emotion running, and then all of a sudden to put the brakes on, sometimes is not that easy.
Okay. Now, aside from the kind of the rotation onto the fire base and so forth, did you have much of any time in the rear?
Not a lot. I took an R&R to Australia after about 10 months, 9 or 10 months. But other than that, we also had what we call stand downs, which is where the company would be pulled out of the out and go back to Chu Lai, which is relatively safe with a large sprawling base, and spend 2 or 3 days unwinding and drinking a lot of beer and eating steaks and kind of regrouping. And so those were always, we looked forward to those.
Okay. When you're out in the field, or at least on the fire base, I mean, did you have a beer ration, for instance? I mean, would you get that kind of thing, or only on stand down?
Now, I remember getting a certain amount. It was very limited, but I remember getting a certain amount of beer, and oftentimes we would carry it. It would be hot, but it didn't matter. It was, and so we might carry a can of beer just for some special occasion, just when you really felt like popping that one open. But,
Okay. And so when you're in the field, if you're out there, several weeks at a time, would you get resupplied out in the field, basically?
We got resupplied every 3 to 4 days. We ate a steady diet pretty much of sea rations. We oftentimes would get our own water out of streams and rivers, but if we were in high areas where we couldn't find any water, they'd also bring out large rubber blivets of water, which tasted like rubber. But yeah, we were resupplied with food, water, ammunition, whatever else we needed routinely.
Okay. And over the course of the year, I mean, are there changes in the weather and the physical conditions that you're operating under?
Yeah, it's either hot and dry or very, very wet. In the movie Forrest Gump, one of the lines was, "One day it started raining and 6 months later it stopped." And I can relate to that. Just driving rain, and of course you get cold, and during the monsoon season your skin gets it's like dishpan hands. You have immersion foot, and your hands are very wet all the time, and the skin cracks, and you get all sorts of infections. And monsoon weather was extremely miserable.
And so would infections or diseases cause people sometimes to have to be taken out of the field?
Oh, sure. Yeah. Oftentimes, the immersion foot, where people really, the skin is coming off, and you can no longer walk, and have to get out of there for a while. We tried as best we could to take care of ourselves, obviously. You try to get your boots and socks off a little bit every night to get them dried out, get your skin dried, but you're in water and mud all the time during monsoons. Pretty miserable.
Okay. What was the ethnic mix of your company?
We had, I don't know what the percentages of, but we had people of all colors. We had people from all walks of life. We had people from all over the country. But again, I didn't see this in the base camp. There were some definite racial tensions, I mean, big time. But in the field, I think people understood by and large that we need each other. And race really didn't play much of a factor. Now, obviously we had racial tensions in the United States at home back then. So you would expect that would carry over to the military. But in the field, it was very, very minimal. I mean, we got along pretty well. I've often thought that I wish everyone could somehow experience that, or some sense of that, so that you know that it's not the color of your skin that makes you, it's who you are. It's what's inside, and we're all the same.
Yeah. And when you come back to the base camp, though, would some people kind of self-segregate, or?
Absolutely, yeah, in several different ways, based on race oftentimes. Marijuana usage was heavy in the military at times, so those who chose to go out and go smoke marijuana would go one direction. Those of us who maybe chose alcohol would go another direction and group together. So yeah, there was segregation based on multiple things.
All right. Now, out in the field, would anybody light up or anything else like that?
I was not aware of it if they did. And I think it was sort of self-policed. I mean, again, we realized that improving our odds of survival meant keeping our act together. And if that was going on, I wasn't aware of it. And I think most people would have blown the whistle and put a stop to it. You just didn't want anybody impaired.
Yeah. All right. Now, when you're in the rear or in base camps or things like that, do you have much contact with any Vietnamese civilians?
No, virtually none. Okay.
Were there some back in the camp in Chu Lai when you went back there?
There were people who worked there. Yeah, but when they brought us back for these stand downs, we were in a compound that was pretty isolated. They took our weapons away from us so we didn't hurt anybody or ourselves. And we had to check all the weapons, all the hand grenades, everything. So, because again, alcohol and firearms and other weapons don't mix very well.
Right. But you're also not in a situation where you can kind of go off base and get yourself in trouble either.
No, we couldn't.
Yeah, so it's pretty kind of tightly regulated as far
Pretty
as that
tightly
goes.
controlled, yeah.
All right. Now, when you're out in the field and so forth, I mean, would you commonly call in air support or artillery support for what you were doing?
Oh yeah, that was very common, yeah. Oftentimes we would, from observation points on tops of hills and things, be able to see some enemy activity. I remember one night we had just moved into our night logger position, and it was on a hill where it was grassy, and so you had a pretty good view of the valley below. And all of a sudden we look out and we see what appeared to be at least a company of NVA moving across this open area. And so we're like, you know, crank up the artillery, crank up everything we can get. And we sat on this hill and watched them. And one of the few times I remember feeling sorry for them. They were just being pounded. And you could see them running and dragging their comrades. And it was, nobody was cheering at that point.
All right. What impression, if any, did you have of your enemy?
We had a lot of respect for them. They were tough, well-trained, home turf, advantage. They were, I would even say feared them. I mean, we weren't, it wasn't that we weren't capable of going up against them and doing just fine, but we didn't like the idea. They were good soldiers.
All right. And what sense did you have of sort of the larger progress of the war effort from where you were?
By that point, by 1960, late 69, 70, most of us, I think, felt we were just going through the motions. The troop withdrawal had already been announced. We were already pulling out. It's like, let's get our job done and get out of here, but let's not do anything stupid and get ourselves killed in the process.
Right. And how much contact did you have with home while you were over there?
Pretty limited. We relied on snail mail back then. And so I got care packages from relatives. My father would write some. I would write once in a while. I had an aunt, a favorite aunt, that kind of took over for my mother in a sense, and sent me care packages and letters. And just a couple of years ago, I wrote her about once a month. And a couple of years ago, I was visiting her in Florida, and she brought out the packet of letters that I had sent her. I reread them. I didn't say much. You know, it's hot here, or it's wet here. You know, everything's fine. But she had kept those all those years.
All right. Now, were there things that you asked for in the care packages, or stuff that you wanted them to send you?
There probably were. One of the things I remember about care packages was Christmas, 1969. These packages probably had been coming in over the course of a month or so. But someone in our company rear had decided that they were going to keep them, batch them. And when we walked onto our fire support base 2 or 3 days before Christmas, they had assembled a mountain of packages for each of us. And we're only going to be there for about 3 days. And I swear, I think every one of those packages contained at least one fruitcake. They were easy to ship, didn't spoil. And but there were some canned goods in there too, and baked goods, and a lot of things like that that people had been nice enough to send. And we all had packages. And but we can only carry so much of this off of there when we leave. And so we just gorged ourselves with, and fruitcake to this day is something I really don't want to look at.
All right. Now, what kind of assignment did you get then for the last part of your tour?
I was fortunate to be assigned back to the combat center where the new troops come in as an instructor. I was an E5 at that point. I got assigned to work with a first lieutenant, a guy named Ken Talia, who had been asked by the division to develop a course called Vietnamese Customs and Relations. And it was an attempt to infuse in the new troops the idea that, again, improving your odds of survival means being a good soldier, first of all, and keeping your act together, but also treating the local population well. Because if you're mistreating them, they're more likely to turn against you, and at night they're coming back to kill you. And so it was a rather interesting course we taught, and we got a lot of mixed reactions from people about, you know, trying to soften things and, you know, represent
Right.
the U.S. well, and not take it out on civilian populations just because you get frustrated. And that's one of the things that happened a lot, I think, because of the number of casualties from booby traps and things like that. It's easy to start to turn on the local population and think that they're all out to get you.
Right.
And oftentimes some of them are, but that doesn't mean everybody is. And so we tried to commit, or tried to teach the new troops over a period of time was, you know, you're better off, you know, treating the local population with respect. Be cautious, you know, keep your guard up, but you're going to improve your odds of having them see us in a positive light.
Okay. Now, at this stage now, do you get out among the civilian population at all, or do you just do this in the abstract from inside the camp?
We did it in the camp. I had more contact with civilians because there were a lot of them who worked on the base. You know, we had housekeepers, and there were people who worked in various facilities. So I had more contact, but still pretty limited.
But you weren't actually going out on patrols with anybody in these areas, and so you're...
No. So I spent 6 months doing that.
Okay. And what... do you remember anything about what kinds of things they tell them, or particular things to do or not do as part of this training program?
I don't remember real specifics, but it was more along the lines of showing respect and treating people like you would like your families treated. And if you're doing things that you wouldn't want others doing to your family, probably ought to take a good hard look at that.
And then while you're on this larger base, would you take mortar or rocket attacks or things like that, or was it quiet?
On occasion. It was fairly rare. I mean, those of us who had been out in the field for a year or so, I felt safer there than probably driving on 131. It was such a large base. There was one instance where early one morning we had small hooches we lived in. There were probably 8 or 10 people who lived in one of these things. We had bunks, slept on clean sheets and things like that. But early one morning about daybreak, a couple of rockets came in and landed right back behind us there, and it was like the freight train, you know. And I heard another one go over, and by the time we're in our bunkers, it's, you know, the rocket attack has stopped. But that was about as close as I came. Had another occasion where I was in the classroom up on the podium with probably 100 or more people in the classroom, and I heard what sounded like a mortar round impacting off in the distance. And so I paused and I said, just stay seated. I walked to the back of the room, and about that time to look out the door, and about that time another round landed closer, and so I told them to evacuate, get to the bunkers. And of course they're new troops, and the room was emptied in like a flash. It was like a covey of quail.
All right. Now, when you're living on the base, now is this a place where you can see more evidence of morale issues, whether drugs or too much alcohol or that kind of thing?
Absolutely, yeah. There were a lot of troops there who weren't busy enough. They had daytime jobs basically for the most part, and myself included. I taught classes during the day, had the evenings free to do whatever I want, you know. So people were bored. So a lot of alcohol and drug use. A lot more racial tension. I was glad to actually leave there. In fact, at one point I went to this lieutenant that I worked for. I also had found out that Charlie Company had been in some pretty heavy action up in the Quezon Valley and lost some people. So I felt guilty about not being there. So I actually went to him and asked him if I could go back. And he said, let's have a beer. And we talked, and he basically said, I'm not going to approve it. And, you know, he probably did me a favor, but I actually would have, at that point in time, preferred to have gone back to my unit. And
now, did it get to the point where there were fights or brawls or whatever?
I was actually in a riot one night. As E5s, on the staff in this compound, we rotated duty, and so every now and then we'd get assigned to do guard duty at night with some new replacements. So we were there. They're basically NCO in charge.
Right.
And we were at this gate, a checkpoint into our compound, and there was an NCO club just up the road. And it closed, and people were streaming down the road going back to their barracks or their hooches. And 2 guys got in an argument. They were right in front of us. One was black, one was white. And the argument had nothing to do with race. They just got in an argument. And one of them he had a drink, and he threw it in the other guy's face. So they start to fight. and then other people jump in. And first thing I know, there are people coming out of we had hundreds and hundreds of new replacements in these barracks. And all these people are pouring out, and it becomes a race riot. And I remember thinking, I survived a year in the bush, and I'm going to die in Vietnam in a race riot. And I was on the radio, had a crank radio, was on the radio asking for help, and we were pretty much isolated. And a young man actually reached through, grabbed me by the shirt. I had an M16. And he grabbed me by the shirt, and I didn't know if he was about to stab me or what. But so I locked and loaded, and I said, "Back off," and he did. Not a good situation.
And so how did that resolve itself?
A captain who was part of our unit, a black captain, came down the road in a Jeep, standing up in the Jeep with a bullhorn, admonishing people to knock it off, get back in their barracks. And little by little, it dissipated. But
So
not a good situation.
But probably a good thing. People weren't carrying weapons at that point.
Yeah, but there were knives being pulled and things like that. I don't know that anyone got seriously hurt, but it could have gone south real quickly.
All right. And did you have a sense that were there people on the base who seemed to be there because they'd been sent back from the line units because they didn't want them, or did you not observe that?
I don't remember seeing that. We had people, when I was in the line unit, we had people re-enlist to get out of the field.
Right.
And so their option would be sign for 3 more years and we'll get you a job as a truck driver or a cook or something safe.
But not the sort of thing where you somebody comes out to the unit and he's just not going to work or do it, so you send him to the rear.
I don't remember that happening.
So the people who were on the base and getting in trouble, I mean, there's a lot of new recruits who were passing through, and then you had other guys who have regular jobs, but just too much time on their hands, and that sort of thing. All right. Now, another thing that comes up, especially when you talk about rear area stuff, there could be issues of corruption of various kinds, or things disappearing or going in the black market or whatever. And is that something you were conscious of at all, or
I was not.
not in your
I was not.
Not in your world? Yeah. Because the kind of stuff you're doing, you're not handling supplies or anything else like that anyway.
Yeah.
You've got another kind of assignment going on.
I've heard stories from other people, but I was not personally.
Yeah, not that part what you're doing. All right. Are there other things that kind of stand out in your memory about the time in Vietnam that you haven't really brought in here yet?
I can remember that there were times when there were funny things that happened. You know, even though most of the time it wasn't funny at the time, but there's still, you look back and there are still things that, you know, there were good times as well. It wasn't all bad, you know, experiences. A case in point, we were set up in a perimeter one night, again, pitch black. We had, as we moved into the perimeter, we took some sniper fire when we were moving across an open area, and then the NVA fired a RPG into our perimeter so they knew where we were. And so it was a little tense that night. And in the middle of the night, very quiet, pitch black, in the middle of the night, someone lets out this blood-curdling scream. I mean, it's just a very high-pitched scream. And the next sound you hear is everyone grabbing the weapon. You can hear that slap, the slapping of the stock, and it's quiet. And I don't think anyone's breathing at that point. We're just waiting. And so everyone's thinking someone had their throat slit or bayoneted or something. It's quiet, no more noise. After a few minutes, the word gets passed, whispered from position to position around the perimeter, that a new replacement had discovered his first leech attached to his body. And he had screamed. And so we're like, okay, everybody breathes a sigh of relief, and it's like, okay. But, you know, still broke the silence. And a few minutes later, we're informed that because our position has been compromised even further, we'll be moving. So it's pitch black. We're trying to pack up as best we can, get our stuff together. We move out in a single file through the jungle, you know, basically hanging on to one another's rucksack. You can't see anything at all. And we didn't go very far until they finally we sat on the trail and sat there till daybreak. And I can remember as it started to get light, people looking at one another and just shaking their heads in disbelief that this really happened. And so it was something we were able to laugh about afterwards, but at the time it was not a fun experience. And so there are things like that that I look back on and you can't help but laugh about it.
Okay. And you mentioned you had taken your turn walking point. Did you do that very much?
I actually walked quite a bit of point. And I got cocky in a way. I think after you do it several times and you know, everything's okay, you know? And you start to feel like I'm good at this and maybe almost invincible. And looking back, I realized that wasn't very smart. But yeah, I actually walked quite a bit of point.
Yeah. And I don't know, was that the case where sort of practice in hunting or things like that was helpful to you?
I think it really was. I was accustomed to moving quietly and scanning, observing, looking for anything unusual. I think it was an advantage. I think by and large, when I look at the people who I served with, most of those who did the best had backgrounds like that. They were just a little more comfortable being in that environment than some others.
Right. Okay. And did you spot much?
No, I was again very fortunate. A good friend of mine, we walked into an ambush one day. I wasn't on point that particular time, but we had actually encountered an NVA squad the previous day and actually caught them by surprise. They were making a lot of noise and we heard them. We were able to come up on them and kill most of them, but some escaped. And so the next day they brought out a tracking dog, a black lab, and a handler. And my platoon was on point that day, and the lab went on alert. And as we were going up a little rise, and so we dropped our packs and moved up there very cautiously. And well, we're spread out, of course. And as we got near the top of this little rise, a twig snapped off to one side. And so everyone's down, crouched down, you know, waiting for something to happen. Nothing happened. And in fact, word got passed up that someone had seen a small animal. I thought that's what made the noise. So we let down our guard a little bit, moved back down to pick up our packs, and they opened up on us. And we've been standing where we found shell cartridges. There had been a guy behind a tree, probably 4 feet away from me, and on the trail. And he'd been on the other side of the tree. So things like that, I often wonder, looking back, how often you were standing almost on top of enemy soldiers and they chose not to fight that day.
Yeah. Was this the kind of country where they would have tunnels or spider holes or bunkers or things?
Some, more spider holes, not a lot of tunnels. We encountered some, but not a lot. We encountered a bunker one time, and a guy did go into it, and he drags out a 100-pound bag of rice that had come from Houston, Texas. We're like, how can this happen? Yeah, but it had been hauled there from somewhere and put in this bunker.
All right. And did you have any Vietnamese scouts or anything like that assigned to you?
We did. In fact, at one point, I was picked from my platoon, and another fellow was picked from his platoon to go back to Chu Lai to pick up 2 Kit Carson scouts. And these were people who had been former enemy soldiers who had come over to our side, probably because we lived a little bit better, even though our conditions weren't the greatest. They were better than the other side, and they got paid a little bit. And so we went back to Chu Lai, to another compound that was surrounded by barbed wire. It was like being in a prison almost, and they had these scouts in this facility. And we spent a couple of days with them to get acquainted. I had had 2 or 3 semesters of French at West Point, so I spoke a little bit of French, very little, but a little bit, enough to be able to communicate with this guy in French. And he knew a little bit of English, and he was learning English. So we got assigned our scout, and then we took them back to the field with us. And I can remember when we got off the chopper, people were very suspicious, as I was. You know, you don't know quite yet whether you can trust this person. But over time, we did develop trust in him, and we got very attached to him, actually. I've often wondered what happened to him.
And did he actually do anything useful?
At times. he traveled very light. He didn't carry a lot of ammunition, and he didn't want to be on point. But there were times when he would point out things helpful, you know, potential booby traps or signs of enemy activity or movement that we might not have noticed. So there were times when he provided some useful services.
And did you learn anything about his actual background, or was he actually with the VC or anything, or?
He claimed he had been VC in the Tam Key area, just a little bit to the north and east of us. And he would go back there periodically and see family or whatever.
Yeah, because a fair number of them seem to have been people who were essentially deserters from the South Vietnamese Army who came over to you guys because the food was better,
Right.
or something along those lines. And, and the stories about them vary a lot in terms of whether or not they knew anything or contributed anything.
Right.
But your guy was somebody you basically at least got along with and had some use for.
We got along fine with him. I'd say his contribution to our unit was minimal, although his counterpart that we picked up at the same time, who was assigned to another platoon, the fellow, a guy named Bobby Taylor from Rhode Island, was his main contact, like I was with our scout. And a few months later, that platoon was on a patrol. Bobby was on point, and he tripped a booby trap, a grenade that was rigged in a tree. And his scout was behind him and lunged forward to try to knock it down with his hand, and lost a hand and had other damage. Bobby died a couple days later, but he tried to save him.
Okay. So he might actually have been on your side.
I suspect so, or at least he was on Bobby's side.
All right. Now, so when do you actually leave Vietnam then?
I left Thanksgiving of 1970.
All right. And
So I spent from roughly May to through November back in Chu Lai.
okay. And were you ready to go by then?
I was definitely ready to go.
All right. And then how do they get you back?
Same way. I think we flew down a military aircraft to Cam Ranh Bay, and then again a charter flight back through Seattle, I think Japan, and then Seattle. Arrived in the middle of the night, I think like most flights did, to avoid protesters, and we just slipped back into the country under the cover of darkness, which is kind of sad. But yeah, we out-processed at Fort Lewis, plane ticket home, and a couple days later I'm home.
Now, did you go home in uniform or in civilian clothes?
I flew home in uniform. I think you had to get the military
Standby fire.
standby fare. You had to be in military. I do recall a lot of people ditching military uniforms. Had an incident in the airport that night. I'd spent the airport in Seattle Airport, SeaTac, and had a flight the next morning. So I'm sitting there in uniform, and a little lounge area. There was like a table in the center with chairs around it, and I had unbuttoned my jacket, which technically you're out of uniform. And I'm sitting there trying to sleep, and I feel something hit me in the back, in the ribs, and through the chair opening. And I just instinctively jumped up and turned around real quickly, and here's an MP. And he had used his stick to get my attention, his nightstick, to get my attention. And as my initial reaction was just instinctive, to jump up and want to almost attack him. But then when I realized quickly that he was a young kid doing his job, he'd been told to patrol the airport, keep people in uniform, you know, and so he says, "Hey, Sarge, button up your coat." I said, "All right." He's just doing his job. So. And there was an older lady sitting across, reading or knitting or something, grandmotherly type, and she never said a word, but she looked over and just had this look of disgust and sighed real heavily, like, "I can't believe what I'm seeing," and she got up and moved over somewhere else, moved away from us.
All right. But now you're basically out of the Army at this point.
Yep.
And so what do you do when you get back home?
Went home in late November. I had already applied for a college. I went at Illinois State while I was in Vietnam. I'd gotten all the paperwork sent to me and applied. Knew I wanted to go back to college. So, I had about a month off, Christmas time, just kind of relaxed, enjoyed family, and by January I'm back in school. And first semester was a little rocky. I took the easiest classes I could take. In hindsight, that was good because I needed to settle down. Felt like many soldiers do today, I think, going to college, felt like a fish out of water, like I didn't quite fit. I remember one time sitting in a student union having a cup of coffee and just looking around and seeing all these other kids having a great time, you know, not a care in the world. And I'm still thinking about my friends, you know, and wondering if they're still alive or what's happened to them.
Yeah. And so did you have kind of adjustment issues beyond that, or?
One of the things I did that worked out very well for me was I was looking for housing when I went to school, and I knew I didn't want to live in a dorm. I was beyond that. And so I went to the student housing office, and I saw a posting for a room, and it said, "Veterans Welcome," which was pretty unusual back in those days. What it turned out to be was a group of veterans who had banded together and were renting a big house, big old house. And so I moved in there for a couple of years, and so had other veterans.
Okay.
And that was a good thing. You know, we could relate to one another. Most of them weren't Vietnam veterans. But they were veterans, and they were not judgmental. They, you know, we could talk about some things and hung out together a lot. So that was a good transition thing for me. And I think spending the extra 6 months in Vietnam was a good transition period as well, even because it got me out of the field, got me, you know, had I gone from the jungle to college campus would have been tougher.
Okay.
Much tougher, I think.
So you got sort of to decompress by stages a little bit, both in the rear and a relatively secure job, and then with this group of people. So you could talk at least some about your experiences. You didn't have to put the whole thing just in a box and hide it somewhere.
Exactly. Although I did a lot of that too. I did a lot of that for about 20 years. But after I got through the first semester of college, I settled down and had, like I say, I'd been a good student before. I became a good student. Went ahead and got my bachelor's degree and still had GI Bill money left over because I'd already gotten 2 semesters from West Point. 3 semesters. So I went ahead and got my master's degree, and that's when I went to work.
And what field were you in?
I got a master's degree in employee health and safety. So my first job out of college was with Alcoa, the aluminum industry, out in the Northwest, working in a couple of manufacturing plants as a safety and training supervisor.
And how did you wind up in Michigan?
Came to Michigan. Actually, Alcoa transferred me to Indiana to a subsidiary. And then came to Michigan to work for the Upjohn Company in Kalamazoo in 1979, and been here ever since.
Okay. And now you're involved with a group outfit called Buddy to Buddy. Can you explain what that is and what that does?
Yeah, the Buddy to Buddy Volunteer Veteran Program is a nonprofit. We're based at the University of Michigan, funded by grants from Major League Baseball charities and McCormick Foundation, a little bit from the VA. And we provide support and outreach assistance to primarily post 9/11 veterans, Iraq and Afghanistan veterans. We're all veterans ourselves, so it's veterans helping veterans. I retired about 4.5 years ago, and after about a year of doing nothing, decided it was time to find something worthwhile doing. And I feel very fortunate to have found this, working with this current generation of veterans. I think anytime you help other people, you help yourself.
And what's your sort of position within the organization?
I coordinate the program for the western half of Michigan. So I have about 50 volunteers in this portion of the state. We have a partnership with the Army National Guard. So we work, about 80% of our work is done with the Army National Guard. They help develop the program, actually.
Right.
And so we spend time at the armories getting to know these young soldiers face to face, getting to know them in person. And we find out what kinds of issues they're dealing with, whether it be employment issues, financial issues, legal issues, family issues, doesn't matter. And we try to get them connected with the resources that are available to help them that they're probably not aware of.
And I guess, what do you see as sort of the biggest obstacles or problems, or the most common things that come up when you're dealing with these guys?
It's a combination of things. The job situation is getting better, but unemployment or underemployment is a big issue, and can often lead to other issues. If a person comes back from deployment and can't find a decent job, put food on the table and support their families, many of them have families, then that leads to family issues and oftentimes substance abuse issues, and it can spiral down pretty quickly.
And you mentioned that you can point them toward resources they might not know they have. How much of an effort do you see the military making to try to at least inform these guys when they come out of what resources are out there for them.
They do a lot, unfortunately, and I was the same way when I got out of the military. You're bombarded with information, but you're not paying attention. You're focused on one thing. You're focused on going home and getting back into what you think is going to be your normal routine. And so you're not paying much attention. And so when it comes time to need those resources, you may have some vague recollection of there's something out there, but I don't know how to access it. So that's where we come in.
Yeah, because I guess we see a certain amount of that with the student veterans that we have on our campus. They kind of come back and often are not aware of or are not necessarily using some of the things that are there.
Exactly.
But at least there is stuff provided now, because when you came back,
and that's a good thing.
there wasn't a whole lot of anything.
That's a good thing. And now of our volunteers, I would say about 60% are Vietnam veterans, and that's one of the things that motivates us. Let's make sure it's different this time.
All right, well, it sounds like definitely a worthwhile thing to be engaged in. I'd just like to thank you for coming out and sharing your story today.
My pleasure.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.